Hi, welcome to an introduction to philosophy, where we examine some of the ultimate questions that philosophers ask. My name is Mark Thorsby, and welcome back. In this video, we're going to be looking at the problem of evil coming out of the work of Saint Augustine of Hippo. So, welcome back, everyone. I hope you guys are doing well. Our talk today is on Saint Augustine and the problem of evil. In our last week, we just sort of began talking about moral theory, and we started off by looking at first the work of Immanuel Kant, his deontological system or his duty-based ethics, in which he articulated a categorical imperative. The two primary formulations of which were number one, you should seek to universalize the maxims that you live by. And if they are universalizable, then those maxims are duties. Or if they can't be universalized, then there's a duty not to do those things. Secondly, the second form of the categorical imperative referred to the idea that you shouldn't use people ever simply and only as a means. After looking at Kant, what do we do then? We took a look at the utilitarianism of John Stuart Mill. And in particular, we noted his moral theory that one should pursue the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. Now, these are two of the central theories in modern ethics. And we're going to take a step back this week, and we're going to be looking at some issues that I think are related sort of from the side angle. And the first one is the problem of evil. And for St. Augustine, the problem of evil today, we're going to see centrally concerns is a theistic concern. That is, Augustine's nervous that if there's a God and God's good, then how could God create a world with evil in it? Now, so we're going to be sort of tracing, or at least in the video today, I'll be tracing his discussion of that from both the City of God and the Confessions. And then in our next video after this, we're going to be looking at the problem of relativism and reflection. Really, I think it's sort of, I wanted to look at the problem of moral evil at this point in the course because after this, we're going to be looking further down the road in terms of other ethical theories, virtue ethics, and so forth. But I thought it's important to stop and think about the fact that there really is such a thing as evil in the world, or at least there appears to be. And any moral theory that exists is going to need to be able to at least explain, describe, or in some way address the problem of evil. There's another great contemporary philosopher by the name of Simon Critchley. He actually is also the editor for the New York Times philosophy blog called The Stone. But Simon Critchley holds, for instance, that ethics begins in disappointment. The idea that, and from what I take from Simon there, is the idea that is that we wouldn't need an ethical theory at all, any ethical theory, if we didn't begin with the idea that things go wrong. And so evil, I think, is sort of a beginning spot for thinking about ethics. And so I want to talk about the problem of evil from Augustine's perspective. But as we continue on the course, I'm going to be trying to relate some of the ideas that Augustine gives us here to some of our theories or our discussions on moral philosophy later. And so that's what we're taking a look at, and especially in the video after this, we'll be looking at the problem of relativism, cultural relativism, and its relation to morality. And of course there, the problem is whether or not evil is a stable enough category. So we're going to be sort of looking at these questions, and so welcome aboard. I hope you guys are doing well. Let me just jump right into this question. Well, what exactly is evil, or what do we mean by the term evil? Notice that people use evil a lot in a lot of different ways and in different contexts. And there's also a lot of discussion about what's known as the radicality of evil. That is, we can talk about things being bad, but it seems like evil is something that's radically different. There's sort of something categorically distinct about evil versus bad. And so this is a distinction in modern philosophy that really probably begins with Friedrich Nietzsche, but I would say for the most part, I'm going to be ignoring that distinction, and I'm going to take evil as essentially meaning anything that's morally wrong. Any sort of moral wrong is going to be considered an evil, at least at this stage in our discussion. If you look interested, there's another great book on evil, is The Banality of Evil by Hannah Arendt, which which argues really the reverse. The evil, the radicality of evil is partially hidden by the fact that it's very banal. So there's lots of interesting discussion on this. You can think about this for the research paper coming up, or just explore for your own edification. But when we ask what is evil, the first thing what I want to do here is distinguish between two principal types of evil. On the one hand, we have what's known as natural evil, and natural evil refers to the evil, or, quote, evil events that occur through nature. A good example of this here, and then we'll talk about moral evil here in a minute. A good example of this would be the tsunami that hit Japan. And in fact, here's a video of the tsunami wave actually hitting Japan. Let me turn that off. Sort of watch this. You can hear whoever's in the room filming this discussing quite vigorously what's happening. And you get a sense of the palpable fear that people feel. But let me be quiet and you take a look at this. And there's the first moment of the tsunami hitting mainland Japan. And you can see the wave just rips apart right through the town. And I'll stop it there, but you can see right there, there's a tremendous amount of devastation that's occurring. But that's an example of what we would call natural evil. And here notice that I think maybe even a more precise way of defining it would be to say that natural evil is when something evil occurs, but occurs without agency, right? The idea is that this is a natural event. There's no one purposely trying to cause the tsunami, but it raises some important moral questions for us, especially if you are a theistic believer, that is, if you believe in God, because then the question is, well, if there's no agency and these horrible events happen, and don't for a moment think that what happened in Japan wasn't horrible. We're talking about tens of thousands of people being killed in an hour's time or something like this. Just tremendous devastation. This is certainly something horrible. All of us would agree that it's a horrible thing. So the question is, why is it that the world can have such naturally horrible events occur? Innocent people being killed in some of the most dramatic and gruesome ways probably imaginable. So that's a sense of what we mean by natural evil. Moral evil, by contrast, is probably what most of us mean when we actually use the term evil. Moral evil refers to when evil actions occur as a direct result of agency. That is, a human being, I guess, or some other potential creature, but it has to be a human, I think, for us, is when another human being purposely acts to create something that we call evil, right? And a good example of that here, I'll just sort of zoom over here, would be here the Holocaust. And here's there was too many horrible things to post here, but this is a photograph. I'm not sure which concentration camp off the top of my head here, but you can see it's just bodies and bodies. And the Holocaust, or any genocide, is a great example, or a horrible example, of moral evil, in which all of these people in this video, and in this photograph here, died really horrible deaths. You can see there's no dignity in their deaths. And this was a result of planned action by other human beings. So this is an example of moral evil. So we can always talk about there being these two different types of evil. So what is the problem of evil in brief? Now, the problem of evil here, the way we're presenting it, is a problem, especially since we're talking about Augustine, it's a problem for Christianity in particular. But I think that the problem of evil can be extrapolated into a greater moral problem. And that's ultimately where I want to go with this. But in today's lesson, we're going to be reviewing the problem of evil from Augustine's perspective. So here's the basic idea. If there's a God, and that God is both the creator of all things and good, then it follows that God cannot act or create evil or create an evil world. But there is evil in the world, so it follows that um, either there is no God or God is not good, right? That's essentially the sort of nuts and bolts of the problem of evil, right? Basically, God, if there's a good God who's all powerful, supremely good, and the creator of the world, God can't create evil. If there's so there shouldn't be evil in the world. There is evil in the world. So either God isn't good or God doesn't exist. One of those two possibilities seems to be the case. The problem of evil is also a famous argument that atheists will, for instance, such as David Hume, consistently use as a reason to reject religion or to reject the Christian faith. So this is a famous problem, and even though David Hume lived in in modern times, if you will, Saint Augustine of Hippo, he lived here. Who we're reading, he's been thinking about this. He was thinking about this issue in really the 3rd century A.D. He lived from 354 to 430. Augustine, he was actually originally the primary priest of at Hippo in northern Africa. He lived during the late Roman Empire, and he was highly influential early Christian philosopher and theologian. In fact, he's probably one of the most influential of all Christian philosophers up until probably St. Thomas Aquinas. He also introduced a very strong Platonic influence into Christianity. A couple of sessions ago, we looked at the philosophy of Plato, in which Plato had a dualistic system of being and becoming, the forms, and I hope you can remember all of this. But the idea of Plato's there was that our minds give us access to the eternal forms, but our bodies exist in this sort of temporary realm of becoming. And ultimately, right, Plato thought that the good was the highest of the forms, right, and so on and so forth. Well, you can see that Augustine here, there's a high potential to Christianize Plato, and that's precisely what Augustine does, except instead of talking about the good, we're talking about the God is the highest form, and all of the forms are immanent within God. And then there's the bifurcation between the world and heaven, ultimately. And Augustine, ultimately, though he doesn't agree with everything Plato thinks, that's for sure, much of what Plato articulates, Augustine thinks is right on because it's rational, it's coherent. And as a result, in his two primary works, the Confessions being one and the City of God being the other primary work, St. Augustine of Hippo sought to create a theological system, Platonic in its orientation, for Christianity. But one of the problems, though, is that if you recall, Plato doesn't really give, he does in the Timaeus, but when we looked at Plato, he doesn't give a very persuasive or a large account for the creation of the world and this sort of thing. Clearly, Augustine, as a Christian, has a whole series of doctrines that he wants to protect, regardless of whether or not natural reason can come to them or not. For instance, the idea that God created the world from nothing, that's a famous argument that Augustine gives, the creation of the world ex nihilo, and so on and so forth. But and so Augustine here, ultimately the problem of evil becomes this problem he has to deal with, and he recognizes it. And so I think he gives probably one of the most persuasive arguments related to the problem of evil. Now, here's some key points regarding Augustine. As I mentioned, Augustine sought to articulate a comprehensive theological system. Also, at this early stage in the 3rd and 4th, in what do we say here from the in the 3rd century here, Augustine, the 4th century, for Augustine, there is no distinction between theology and philosophy. In these early years, the idea of philosophizing about God is considered philosophy. Today, we see that as the work of theology versus natural philosophy. That distinction actually came from St. Thomas Aquinas in the 12th century, but So at this point, it's important to note that even though he's doing a theology, it's very important work philosophically, at least within the history of philosophy. Now, before Augustine became a Christian, if you read his Confessions, and by the way, I think anyone who considers themselves educated needs to read the Confessions before they graduate. I think it's a critical text within the humanities that people should read, regardless of their religious orientation. But in the Confessions, one of the things Augustine talks about is how he became a Christian and so forth. And historically, before Augustine was a Christian, he was actually a Manichaean. And so we'll see that part of his overriding concern in this discussion of the problem of evil is he wants to argue against Manichaeism. That's his first religion. Now, Manichaeism was actually an ancient Persian religion, so it began in what today is modern-day Iran. And this religion thrived between the 3rd and 7th centuries A.D. And Augustine was initially, in his early days, as a young man, he was a Manichaeanist. Now, the Manichaeanists believed that ultimately they had a dualistic cosmology, and they believed that the world essentially had two principles that governed it: a good principle and a bad principle. Principle of light and of spiritual light, and a principle of material darkness, good and evil. And that ultimately the world, all of the evil in the world, could be understood as being a result of this evil principle. And all of the good in the world could be understood as the good principle. And these two principles were warring themselves out, or at least they're at war with each other. And then ultimately the religion was about sort of kind of finding that balance for happiness. But you're going to see here that Augustine, once he becomes a Christian, and under at least Christianity, both I would say Protestant and Catholic Christianity, and of course Augustine was a Catholic. For Christians, though, there isn't a dual principle. In fact, some Christians, I shouldn't say many, but some Christians mistakenly think of the devil as sort of the opposite principle, as God or something like that. But that doesn't work, because in Christianity, it's a monotheistic religion where God is seen as supremely powerful. That is, no one or nothing is more powerful than God. God is completely good. He's omniscient. He's omnipotent. He's all-powerful. And because of that, it raises this question, well, if all things God, that must mean that if God is supreme, good, and all-powerful, and the creator of all things in the world, the universe, that means that all things that God creates must be good. Because something evil cannot come from something good. Because otherwise, we'd have to say that God's evil. So what then is evil? And you can see here that Augustine wants to avoid this sort of dualism, this dualistic cosmology, in order to maintain the all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good nature of God. So what sort of account can Augustine give? Now you're going to see that the reading that I've given you here comes in sort of 3 different sections. The first section is titled "All Finitely Good Things Are Corruptible." In here, I believe this text is this is an excerpt from the Confessions in particular, whereas later on we'll see an excerpt from the City of God. But here we see Augustine really addressing this question in terms of corruption, in terms of what is corruptible. So the first thing here is that anything that exists, well, here, let's just run through the reasoning here, and then we can talk about it as we go. The first point here is that all things are good even if they're corrupted, right? What he wants to argue is that when God since God is good, all things that God creates must be good. So that means that things are all things are good, right? And the question though is what happens when they're corrupted? Because he's going to see here that he has this sense that evil is actually a type of corruption. It's not a type of substance, right? There's 2 types of things we might say. There's things in the world that have substance, things like me, or the coffee cup, right? Or a book I read. Though all books have substance, all of these things have some substantial nature to them. But he's going to argue that evil does not have substance. Rather, evil is the corruption of the nature that a specific substance might have. Okay, so all things are good even if they're corrupted in his view. For how could something be corrupted if it was not first good? And here he has something of a little logical argument that I think is sort of cute and unique. And this is the idea that evil is always a form of corruption, right? But the thing is here is that something can only be considered corrupted if it was first good to begin with, right? You can't corrupt something that's already corrupted, right? Corruption can only happen to things that are already good, right? So, but the question is, what exactly is corruption, though? And here, I think this is where I think it's quite provocative. He says, corruption harms. So, the fundamental attribute of corruption is a harm upon the substance. So, for instance, we can take me as an example. So, let's imagine that um, I become corrupted somehow, right? Let's imagine I take bribes for grades, right? Sort of a funny example here, since I'm a teacher. Let's imagine that I'm corrupted and I take bribes, and then I'll give you a good grade for your how much money. So the more money, the better the grade, right? But you can see here that the idea that Augustine thinks here is that I to begin with am a substance created by God, which means I must be good. But if I'm being corrupted, that means I'm being harmed. So I'm actually being damaged by this corruption. So corruption is something that harms, which means evil fundamentally is related to this notion of harm, right? So thus things must begin as if they can be corrupted. So in order for something to be corrupted or harmed, it has to start off not being corrupted, right? So it has to begin as good. So if something is deprived, though, of all of its good, then it ceases to exist. So his notion here is that corruption, something that gets completely corrupted, is just simply destroyed, right? That's because corruption doesn't have substance. It rather refers to an attribute, to an attribution of a substance. So therefore, whatever is good, and therefore evil has no substance. And so this is the sort of first part of his argument, and he ends with this quote, which I think is pretty important. So I threw it up here for you to read, and that's where Augustine says, "quote I understand, therefore, and it was made most clear to me that thou," and he's talking to God here, that God made all things good, nor is there any substance at all that's not made by God. And because all that God has made is not equal, each by itself is good, and the sum of all of them is good, for our God made all things very good. So you can see here, he's just, in a very Christian sense, though, he's articulating this idea that all things that exist as substances, and as such are good, because they're created by God, and God is good. Evil isn't a substance, it's a form of corruption. Now, but here he's also making an interesting distinction, the idea that even though God created all things are good, not all things are created equal. And so that means that some things are different in terms of their level of possible or potential corruption. So we can talk about particulars, but we can also talk about the thing as a whole. All of the particulars may not be equal, but they're all created good. And all of it combined as a fuller tapestry must be good as in total. That's his view. So then he moves on, or at least with the excerpt I've given you to look at moves on into this section known as evil as privation. And this is the central argument of Augustine when it comes to the problem of evil. Okay, and let me just run through it sort of slowly here. So from God's perspective, there can be no evil, first and foremost, because God created the world, and he created everything in the world, and since God is good, when God looks at the world, he sees a good world, right? This is important because by the way, in the reading, Augustine is constantly quoting back from the Bible, right? Think, for instance, when God creates the world at the end of the book of Genesis, right, God says, and it was good, and so he rested, right? So there's this notion here that creation is good. So the question, though, is from God's perspective, there's no evil then, because there's no substantial nature to evil, because only substances get created. Then the question is, well, why is it that we see evil in the world? And here we get this notion that evil is a disharmony. And here you can think about corruption, right? Something is corrupted when it becomes disharmonious in itself, right? Think about, for instance, though it's not an example of moral problem, but think, for instance, of a car that breaks down, the engine gets corrupted or something, right? What happens is ultimately the engine stops working correctly with itself or with the other with its other parts. So evil, corruption can also be recognized as a sort of disharmony. We get this great quote from Augustine. In the parts of creation, some things, because they do not harmonize with others, are considered evil. So we start to get this notion then that evil is when we recognize the disharmony among particulars in our experience, right? But then he goes on, he says, yet the things that do not harmonize, yet the things that do not harmonize completely still harmonize with the inferior parts of creation. And here when he says inferior, he says earthly, and I think what he really means is the material aspects of nature. So what does this mean? It's this idea that, because he wants to solve this problem, is that there's not really evil, but we recognize things as being evil. So how is that the case? Well, we recognize the disharmony of things, right? But what he wants to say is that even though they may be disharmonious in one way, all things, insofar as they exist, harmonize with the inferior parts of creation, with the material creation. So for instance, even though there are thieves that exist in the world, right, and they represent maybe a disharmony of the political sphere, Augustine wants to say that because they are still substances in the world, that is, they're still beings or persons that live in the world, they still do harmonize with the other substantial elements in the world, the material elements in the world, right? Even the thief drinks water, right? So even though maybe the thief doesn't harmonize morally, they harmonize materially. And so in this sense, we can say that even the things that don't harmonize are still part of creation in the larger sense, and therefore good. At least that's his argument. And so the higher things, so now he's made this distinction between the higher and the lower things, and The City of God as a book is essentially an argument about a higher city and a lower city, the city on heaven and the city on earth. He wants to say that the higher things are better than the lower, but the combination of having both the lower and the higher is better than just having the higher alone. Therefore, there is no evil in the world as such, right? So the argument here is that even though some things don't harmonize in the higher level, right, the moral level or political level or something, they do harmonize with the overall, and it's better that we have a world, a material world, and a spiritual world than just having one without the other. And so, as such, the things that we think are evil are not really evil. You can see here what he's trying to sort of explain here is what you might say is the illusion of evil. Now, Augustine, though, is more nuanced thinker than this, and he's sort of ultimately forced to posit that even this solution doesn't fully explain the whole problem. Now, we're going to get to evil as privation in a moment here, even though we've just mainly been talking about that. So this sort of next section here, I'm going to take it, sort of give you by numerical point. And I believe this is a selection that comes at a different section in the City of God. But in this section, he's going to talk about privation as well. Okay. So number point one here is that for a Christian, and of course, he's talking about Christians, but this argument here would equally work with anyone who believed in a monotheistic God that was good. So for a Christian, though, he says it's enough to believe that the cause of the world is a good God, and the Christian will believe that on faith. So you can see here, he's not trying to give an argument for God's existence. So he's not trying to prove that God exists. He's beginning with the supposition that he's already talking to Christians, right? So for a Christian, it's enough to believe that the cause of the world is a good God. And what this means is that furthermore, nothing which has being, has existence, can exist apart from God's will. And then he mentions that God is triune, and he mentions the Trinity, that God is Father, Son, Spirit at the same time. And what he wants to argue is sort of use this. He's sort of also just mentioning the principal doctrines of the Christian faith. What he wants to argue here is that everything was created from this triune good God. And all of it, the world, must therefore be good. Now, but wait a second. Even though God is supremely and immutably good, he says it doesn't follow that all things created are created equally good, right? So here he wants to say that listen, God is a triune God or whatnot, is immutably good and always supremely good, but it doesn't follow that because God is good, that doesn't follow that all things in creation are equally as good and immutable. Right? Things in creation are not created equally, right? So then there's this idea that all things are good in themselves, though he repeats this. All things are good in themselves as particulars, and all things are good as a whole. And that goes back to his argument regarding the substances and this sort of thing, and also the disharmony, right? But he wants to maintain that, listen, there can be a variation in creation ultimately. Now, the next important point there is that good cannot beget evil, right? So evil cannot come from something that's good. Good can only beget good, ultimately. So therefore, evil is a privation of being. So evil, then, in his view, is a lack. It's an emptiness, right? So, and we're going to get back to the problem of natural and moral evil here at the conclusion of looking at his sort of overall argument, because I think there's an important way we can understand the problem of natural and moral evil from Augustine's perspective. But evil is a privation. It's a lack of being, right? And here's so the idea is that, for instance, as a human being, right, when I commit an evil act, I'm actually degrading myself. I'm privating myself. I'm losing part of my substantial nature. That's what he means. That's what it means to commit evil. Now, because I still exist, even if I'm a murderer and I'm alive and breathing, I'm still good in this overall sense, but I'm corrupted. And because I'm corrupted, there's a privation. There's a problem with me, namely that I'm lacking the full measure of being that I should have as a human being, right? So evil as such has no substance, but needs to be understood as a lack. And there's this great quote I want to read you, and that's this. When a cure, and he gives the example of, remember, if you think of evil as a privation, you can give the example of when someone becomes sick, right? And he gives this idea of when a cure is effected, when you get a cure, the evils which were present, for instance, the sickness or the wounds, they don't retreat and go somewhere else. Rather, they simply do not exist anymore. For such evil is not a substance. The wound or the disease is a defect of the bodily substance, which as a substance is good. Evil, then, is an accident. That is, it's a privation of that good which is in us, or that which is good, that which is good in us. Right. So you think about it. Right. For instance, when we would say that, for instance, think about someone who had think about someone who was stabbed. For instance, if someone's stabbed, that's clearly a case of moral evil. But when we get rid of the stabbing wound, it's not like the wound goes somewhere else, right? Quite the contrary. The wound, when we're healed, disappears. And for him, that shows that the evil is overcome not by moving the evil, which would mean that evil would have to be a substance, by rather annihilating the evil. That is, evil, we get rid of evil by actually improving the original substance, and evil disappears. So evil doesn't have a substantial nature, right? It's not a something as such. It's rather a lack or something missing. It's an accident. It's a characteristic of substances, right? So when we go back to the problem of evil, then we can say that all of nature is therefore good. At least Augustine, I guess, it says, but nature is not as good as the Creator, right? So he wants to maintain the idea that God is good, but that's categorically distinct from the substantial nature we're talking about in the world. The world is good, but the world is corruptible, right? So when good is diminished, there is evil. That's when we recognize something as being evil, when we see the good in something being diminished. Pardon me. If the good is diminished completely, then the thing that we said was evil. I'm sorry. If the good is diminished completely, then the thing itself ceases to exist, right? And where there is no privation of the good, there is no evil. So if there is something that cannot be deprived of its good, then that thing would be recognized as an incorruptible entity. And the incorruptible entity element, this is a part that's more for application in his later theology, or his other elements of his theological system. So number 3, even if something is corrupted, if it still exists, it can still be or do good in some sense. So therefore, every actual entity is therefore good, a greater good if it cannot be corrupted, and a lesser good if it can be, right? So you can see here he thinks that anything that has actual existence is good, but things can be, they're better goods if they're not corrupted or can't be corrupted, and they're lesser goods if they can be corrupted. So that means 5 that there can be nothing evil except something that's good. But this leads to a very bizarre problem because it sounds absurd, right? It sounds as if that means that everything that's evil is good, right? Because if there wasn't something good, then the evil couldn't reveal itself because it's a privation or a corruption. So then Augustine says, absurd as this sounds, nevertheless, the logical connections of the argument compel us to it as inevitable. So he wants to argue here that it sounds crazy, but he doesn't see a way out of the problem here. It looks like the only conclusion is that good and evil are somehow simultaneous, right? It's because every entity, even if it's a defective one, insofar as it is an entity, that is, insofar as it has existence, is good. And so insofar as it's defective, we can say it's evil. So you can see here we begin to gain an understanding from God's perspective, everything's good, but from our perspective, we can and I guess God could recognize this too, is that insofar as there's defects within a substance, that's what we mean by the evil, right? So is there a limitation in our logic then? Now remember, logic is governed by what's known as the law of non-contradiction. That's the idea that something cannot both be and not be at the same time. You can't say that I'm watching this video and I'm not watching the video at the same time, at the same moment, in the same respect. That doesn't make any sense. So that means that things that are contraries can't exist simultaneously. Yet good and evil are contraries, right? So, but the conclusion here seems to argue that a thing can be both good and evil simultaneously, right? A thing is good insofar as it maintains its substantial nature, and it's evil insofar as it's defective in that substantial nature. And we recognize that there are things that are evil in the world, moral evils, right? We saw an example. So the question is, that means that the people who committed the Holocaust, right, committed an evil act, but insofar as they existed, they were good in some sense. But you can see that this means that evil and good are in fact what Augustine calls coexistent contraries. They're contraries, but they somehow exist simultaneously. Okay? So from human, and then Augustine moves and discusses human nature, right? He says for human nature, the difference is that human beings have a substantial nature, but part of our nature is that we have a will, right? Is that we have the capacity to choose, to be free, to orient our lives in certain directions. And so from human nature, he says that you can either end up with an evil will or a good will. A good will obviously seeks the good in being, and an evil will seeks disharmony, right? Or corruption. And so he says that you can have an evil and a good will, right? And that's ultimately going to be the way he understands moral evil. Moral evil is the result of moral evil is the result of having an evil will. That is actively trying to disharmonize the world. That's what evil is. And what's good is to try to harmonize it ultimately. You can see here, I like this language of the harmonization. I think that's sort of interesting. So what's the sort of conclusion here? Where can we end up with this? Well, the first conclusion for Augustine is that all evil is the privation of being, first and foremost. That's what evil is. And privation takes the form of a corruption or a disharmony, right? So that's how we can know whether or not something is evil or not, based upon whether or not we can recognize there being a disharmony or a corruption. Now, this also means, though, that the only way, from Augustine's perspective, that we can recognize something as being corrupt is if we can already have knowledge of the substance of a thing, right? And so I think that things become a little problematic for Augustine, or at least for us moderns, when we read Augustine here, is, well, wait a second, how is it that we can know what the harmonious, uncorrupted, substantial nature of a human being should be? A good example here would be to think about homosexuality, right? Christians, or at least many Christians, especially ancient classical Christians and sort of kind of conservative Catholics, for instance, which were the type of people who'd be reading Augustine. From these people's perspective, homosexuality is considered a sin. And why is it considered a sin? Well, it's considered a sin because it's considered a corruption of the ways in which we're supposed to be, right? So the idea there is that human beings are supposed to be heterosexual, and that homosexuality is seen as a disharmony of our essential nature, right? So this is the sort of way that, for instance, a Catholic would understand, probably at least in a classical sense, why homosexuality is morally wrong, or considered evil. That's because it's a form of the privation of our natural disposition. Now, but you can see here that what if there is no knowledge? What if we don't know from the beginning what our natural substantial nature should be, right? That is, what if it's not the case that every person is born and is naturally born or created as a heterosexual? If that's the case, then identifying the corruption of something becomes somewhat arbitrary, because then it looks like I'm only choosing what's disharmonious based upon my own perspective. And so you can see here, I'm not exactly sure, though I like this idea of saying that evil is a privation. I think that the notion of seeing that evil is a corruption or a disharmony, this smuggles in the idea of a natural law theory where we have an already worked out conception of what human beings should look like. If that conception is not available, then I think that it's difficult to argue what would be a natural corruption of something. I hope that makes sense here. So this becomes a limitation in terms of the applicability of Augustine's theory for modern theory, for us moderns. So number 3, though, so let's talk about natural versus moral evil. Let's start with natural evil. So what is natural evil? Well, first off, Augustine doesn't answer the question directly, so we're going to do this by extension or extrapolation. We've seen this idea that evil is a privation or a disharmony, but that ultimately, from Augustine's perspective, all things in reality are just good because God created them. So that would mean that natural evil, things like the tsunami, and think about it here, some of you may still be thinking, how is the tsunami evil? But think about it. Imagine if your entire family was killed in that tsunami. Wouldn't you, at the end of that day, learning that knowledge, wouldn't you cry out and be like, how could the world be good? How could there be a God who would let such a thing happen? You can imagine people asking those questions because people do ask those questions. So that means that when we look at a problem like natural evil and the tsunami, by extension, we have to say that it's a perspective of disharmony. That is, when we look, and here, this is not what Augustine's saying, this is my interpretation or my application of Augustine to the problem, is that would mean that natural evil is when we recognize the corruption of something that happens without agency in nature. So for instance, the tsunami washes in, and the tsunami annihilates, destroys the entire civilization, at least on that border city that coastal town we're watching the video of, right? That's the natural evil there is a disharmony that's destroying everything. So I can understand there the notion that when I recognize the privation of my community through some sort of natural disaster, I'm seeing something that is analogous to evil in this Augustine-like conception. So natural evil does not mean that evil is a real property in the world. It's not a real substance in the world. It's rather a accidental quality of particular substances that exist in the world. Now, finally, when we turn to the problem of moral evil, Augustine gives us a more clear answer. Moral evil, though, he says, is a result of a corrupted will, and that's endemic to human nature. So, ultimately, he sees that human beings have a sort of corrupted nature automatically, and this goes to his seminal theory of sin, which I won't go into, right? But he sees that he thinks that human beings are corrupted. Our will is what's corrupted, and thus unless we're educated out of it or saved through faith, most of us are going to naturally have an evil will, which means that we're going to actually actively seek types of disharmonies and privations that ultimately are the privation of ourselves, right? So moral evil is a little more tricky because this seems to suddenly involve a whole theory here about freedom and what it means to say that people have will at all. or to say that people want to do specific things. Um, there's a great essay, modern essay by Harry Frankfurt on the will that I had thought about maybe talking about after this video, or doing a lecture on, but I ultimately haven't done one on. But I encourage you to read Harry Frankfurt's essay here on the will and persons, and I think there's a pretty interesting explanation, plausible explanation regarding what it is we mean when we say we have free will. But that's its own sort of kit and caboodle here. One thing that's worth mentioning is that in ethics, the notion of the freedom is utterly important, because we would never say that someone's morally guilty of something that they could not themselves control, right? So that's why, for instance, we don't blame a soldier who's ordered to shoot or drop a bomb on a village. We don't blame the soldier because we say that they didn't have a choice. They're just following orders, right? We hold people morally responsible when we recognize that they have the freedom to act otherwise. And so freedom is a very, very important category to moral theory as a result. So, but anyway, to conclude the rest of it here, for the problem of evil, that means that God, for Augustine, he's not responsible for the evil in the world, because in a very real sense, evil has no reality, right? Evil is rather the corruption of things that exist in the world. Now, some of you may be asking, but wait a second. Didn't God create a world in which the corruptibility of things was possible? Doesn't that put God on the hook, per se? And I think that's a good question. And I think ultimately, though, Augustine is forced not to actually address that question, but really to recede into his faith and just say, listen, at the end of the day, I don't fully understand why there's evil in the world, but I trust that God is good, and that even though I have a perspective that makes it very difficult for me to recognize evil as privation, ultimately I should trust it. So Augustine, as a Christian, as a theologian, he sort of leans in on his faith when he gets to some of these tougher questions. Now, I think that when we come to philosophy, the way we've been addressing it, we don't have that same, or at least most of us here don't have that same sort of crutch of faith where we can say, well, we believe in faith. Now, why is I think this is important? Because ultimately I think that we can use Augustine here as a model for thinking about how evil and wrongdoing exist in the world. And what we can say perhaps is that maybe evil can be recognized as the corruption or the disharmonies that exist within specific communities. And that's the sort of secularization that I want to make of Augustine here. And we're going to see in our next video where we talk about relativism, it's pretty interesting and important sort of distinction, or at least I think it has important consequences. Because ultimately, with the problem of relativism becomes, well, wait a second, if every culture has a different view of what's good and bad, then that means that it looks like it's arbitrary, right? What's evil, what we see as corruption, or what we see as a harmony, seems to be, well, just based upon what sort of society or culture we're born into. And this becomes problematic for philosophy in a very real sense. And so we're going to be looking at the problem of relativism in reflection by looking at a chapter from Bernard Williams' book, The Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy, in our next video. And I'm hoping that these two videos will pair nicely for an engagement with questions regarding evil, good, and ultimately moral objectivity and certainty. So that's what we're going to be looking at in the next couple of videos. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something from it. I'll talk to you guys later. Thanks a lot. Bye.